Hello, welcome to the channel. If you're a fan of scary creatures and chilling stories, subscribe to the channel to support us and follow the stories. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching this video from, all because the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of the Grand Canyon, painting the rock formations in hues of deep orange and purple. Tom Reeves, a seasoned ecotourism guide with weathered skin and sharp blue eyes, led his group of eager tourists along a narrow path that snaked its way down the canyon wall. His voice carried easily over the gentle breeze, a mix of enthusiasm and reverence for the natural wonder surrounding them. "Folks, we're about to reach one of my favorite spots in the entire canyon," Tom announced, pausing to let the group catch up. "It's a place where the very walls seem to speak to you." A middle-aged woman with a wide-brimmed hat and a camera around her neck piped up, "You mean like an echo?" Tom grinned, his teeth a stark white against his tanned face. "Exactly like an echo, Mrs. Hartley. But trust me, this is no ordinary echo." The group continued their descent, the crunch of gravel under their boots and the occasional click of a camera shutter breaking the natural silence. Tom kept a watchful eye on his charges, making sure no one strayed too close to the edge or fell behind. Safety was always his primary concern. But today, a nagging feeling of unease tickled the back of his mind. As they rounded a bend, the path opened up into a small plateau overlooking a vast expanse of the canyon. The tourists gasped in awe at the breathtaking view, cameras immediately coming up to capture the moment. "All right, everyone," Tom called out, clapping his hands to get their attention. "This is it, the echo chamber, as I like to call it. Now who wants to give it a try?" A young man in his early 20s, sporting a backwards baseball cap and a University of Arizona t-shirt, stepped forward. "I'll do it." Tom nodded approvingly. "Excellent. What's your name, son?" "Jake," the young man replied with a grin. "All right, Jake, I want you to face that far wall over there," Tom instructed, pointing to a sheer cliff face about 100 yards away. "Now give us your best yell. Don't hold back." Jake took a deep breath, cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a boisterous, "Hello, Canyon." The group waited in anticipation as the sound traveled across the open space. A moment later, the echo returned, clear as day. "Hello, Canyon." Jake's face lit up with excitement. "Wow, that was cool." Tom smiled, but something about the echo had set his nerves on edge. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it had sounded off somehow. Pushing the thought aside, he addressed the group. "Great job, Jake. Now, who else wants to give it a try?" One by one, the tourists took turns shouting into the canyon, each echo returning faithfully. Tom watched and listened carefully, that uneasy feeling growing with each repetition. There was something about the tone, the inflection of the echoes that just wasn't right. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the plateau, Tom decided it was time to wrap things up. "All right, folks, we should start heading back now, but before we go, how about I give you one last demonstration?" The group murmured in agreement, eager to hear their guide's voice echo across the canyon. Tom stepped forward, took a deep breath, and called out in his strong, clear voice, "Grand Canyon, can you hear me?" As the sound of his voice faded, Tom felt his heart begin to race. The seconds stretched out, feeling like an eternity. And then the echo returned. "Can you hear me, Tom?" A chill ran down Tom's spine. The voice that came back wasn't just an echo. It was different, as if someone was imitating him. The inflection was wrong, the tone slightly off, and most disturbingly, it had used his name. Tom froze, his eyes wide as he stared out into the canyon. The tourists, oblivious to the subtle difference, broke into applause. "That was amazing," Mrs. Hartley exclaimed. "It almost sounded like the canyon was answering you directly." Tom forced a smile, trying to hide his unease. "Yeah, it's quite something, isn't it? All right, let's start making our way back up. It'll be dark soon." As they began their ascent, Tom's mind raced. He'd been guiding tours in the Grand Canyon for over a decade, and he'd never experienced anything like this. The echo had always been a highlight of his tours, but it had never deviated from a simple repetition of what was shouted. This was different. This was impossible. The chatter of the tourists faded into background noise as Tom led them back up the path, his thoughts consumed by what he'd heard. He mechanically pointed out interesting rock formations and answered questions, but his heart wasn't in it. All he could think about was that echo. As they reached the rim of the canyon, the sky ablaze with the colors of sunset, Tom bid farewell to his group. The tourists dispersed, chattering excitedly about their adventure. But Tom lingered, staring out over the vast expanse of the canyon. A hand on his shoulder startled him out of his reverie. It was Jake, the young man who had volunteered to yell first. "Hey, Mr. Reeves," Jake said, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" Tom nodded, trying to shake off his unease. "Sure, Jake. What's on your mind?" Jake glanced around, making sure the others were out of earshot. "That last echo when you called out, did you hear it? I mean, really hear it?" Tom's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" "It was different," Jake said, his eyes wide. "It wasn't just repeating what you said, it answered you, and it knew your name." For a moment, Tom considered brushing it off, laughing it away as a trick of the wind or an overactive imagination. But the earnest look in Jake's eyes made him pause. "You're right," Tom admitted quietly. "I heard it too. I've never experienced anything like that before." Jake nodded, looking relieved. "I thought I was going crazy. What do you think it means?" Tom shook his head, his gaze drawn back to the canyon. "I don't know, Jake, but I intend to find out." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Tom made a decision. He would return to the echo chamber tomorrow, alone. He needed to understand what had happened, to prove to himself that it wasn't just his imagination playing tricks on him. Little did Tom know, as he drove home that night, his mind replaying the strange echo over and over, that this was just the beginning. The Grand Canyon had spoken to him, and nothing would ever be the same again. The pre-dawn air was crisp and biting as Tom Reeves made his way down the familiar trail, his breath forming small clouds in the dim light. The canyon was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual chatter of tourists and wildlife. Tom's footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path, each step bringing him closer to the echo chamber and the mystery that awaited him. As he rounded the final bend, the plateau came into view, bathed in the soft purple light of the approaching dawn. Tom paused, his heart racing with a mix of anticipation and fear. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. "All right, Tom," he muttered to himself. "Let's get to the bottom of this." He approached the spot where he usually positioned his tour groups and cleared his throat. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the morning. "Hello?" Tom called out, his voice strong and clear. "Is anyone there?" The words echoed across the canyon, bouncing off the far wall and returning to him. But it was just that, a normal echo, a faithful repetition of his own voice. Tom frowned, a mixture of relief and disappointment washing over him. He tried again, this time with a different approach. "Grand Canyon, can you hear me?" Again, only the standard echo returned. Tom ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. Had he imagined the whole thing yesterday? Was the stress of the job finally getting to him? For the next hour, Tom experimented with different phrases, tones, and even whistles and claps. Each time, the canyon responded with nothing more than a normal echo. As the sun began to peek over the rim of the canyon, painting the rocks in brilliant oranges and reds, Tom was ready to give up. "I must be losing my mind," he muttered, shaking his head. As he turned to leave, a glint of something caught his eye. Near the base of the canyon wall, partially hidden behind a large boulder, was what looked like an opening. Curiosity piqued, Tom cautiously made his way towards it. As he got closer, he realized it was a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Strange symbols were carved into the rock around the opening, unlike any petroglyphs Tom had seen before. "What in the world?" Tom whispered, running his fingers over the strange markings. A sudden chill ran down his spine, and he jerked his hand back. The air around the crevice seemed colder, and Tom could have sworn he heard a faint whisper coming from within. Gathering his courage, Tom called out again, this time directing his voice towards the crevice. "Hello? Is someone there?" The response came almost immediately, but it wasn't an echo. It was a whisper barely audible that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tom, help us." Tom stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice had sounded like his own, but distorted as if coming from underwater. "Who are you?" Tom demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The whisper came again, louder this time. "We are trapped. Release us." Tom's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, maybe a hidden speaker system set up by pranksters. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. There was something unnatural, something otherworldly about this phenomenon. Taking a deep breath, Tom stepped closer to the crevice. "How can I help you? What do you need me to do?" The response was immediate and chilling. "Enter. Join us." A gust of cold air rushed out of the crevice, carrying with it the faint sound of many voices whispering in unison. Tom stumbled back, his heart racing. "No," he said firmly, more to himself than to the voices. "I'm not going in there, not without understanding what's going on." The whispering intensified, becoming more insistent. "Tom, we need you. Come to us." Tom turned and ran, not stopping until he reached the rim of the canyon. He leaned against a boulder, gasping for breath, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. As he caught his breath, Tom's analytical mind began to take over. He needed to approach this systematically. First, he needed to document everything he had seen and heard. Then, he needed to research those strange symbols. And finally, he needed to find someone he could trust to help him investigate further. Tom made his way back to his Jeep, his mind already formulating a plan. He would need to be careful about how he presented this to others. The last thing he wanted was to be labeled as a crackpot or to start a panic among the tourists. As he drove home, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. The Grand Canyon had always been a place of wonder and mystery, but now it held a darker secret, one that was calling out to him specifically. Back at his small cabin on the outskirts of the nearest town, Tom immediately went to his computer. He spent hours researching ancient Native American legends, geological anomalies, and even fringe theories about dimensional portals. Nothing quite matched what he had experienced, but he found enough to convince him that he wasn't entirely alone in encountering unexplainable phenomena in the area. As the day wore on, Tom's excitement grew. Despite the fear and uncertainty, there was a part of him that thrilled at the discovery. This could be the find of a lifetime, something that could revolutionize our understanding of the natural world. But with that excitement came a heavy sense of responsibility. Whatever was happening in that crevice, whatever force was calling out to him, it clearly had the power to affect the real world. The altered echoes, the whispers, the cold air, all of it pointed to something beyond current scientific understanding. As night fell, Tom sat on his porch, staring out at the distant silhouette of the canyon. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself, but he also knew he had to be careful about who he told. The wrong move could lead to the site being swarmed by government agencies or thrill-seeking tourists, potentially causing more harm than good. He thought back to the young man from yesterday's tour, Jake. The kid had noticed the strange echo too. Maybe he could be a potential ally in this investigation. Tom's mind was made up. Tomorrow he would return to the echo chamber, this time armed with recording equipment and cameras. He would document everything he could about the crevice and the symbols. And then he would reach out to Jake and see if he was willing to help. As he headed to bed that night, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed. The echo of his own voice, coming back different, had set him on a path he never could have anticipated. Whatever lay ahead, Tom knew one thing for certain: the Grand Canyon would never be the same to him again. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the rim of the Grand Canyon as Tom Reeves led his latest group of tourists down the now familiar path. It had been 3 weeks since his early morning encounter with the mysterious crevice, and in that time, he had transformed his tour into something entirely new. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom announced, his voice carrying easily over the excited chatter of the group, "we're about to experience something truly extraordinary. Something that defies explanation and challenges everything we think we know about acoustics and natural phenomena." A middle-aged man in a Hawaiian shirt raised his hand. "Is this the miracle echo we've been hearing about?" Tom grinned, a mixture of pride and unease flickering across his face. "That's right, sir. The very same. I promise you, it's unlike anything you've ever heard before." As they approached the echo chamber, Tom could feel the anticipation building in the group. Word had spread quickly about the unusual acoustic properties of this particular spot, and his tours had been booked solid for weeks. They reached the plateau, and Tom positioned the group carefully, making sure everyone had a clear view of the canyon wall where the echo would return. "Now, who would like to go first?" Tom asked, scanning the eager faces before him. A young woman with bright red hair stepped forward, her hand shooting up. "Me. I've been dying to try this." Tom nodded, gesturing for her to take center stage. "All right, miss. What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied, grinning from ear to ear. "Okay, Sarah. I want you to face that far wall and call out your name. Don't be shy. Give it all you've got." Sarah took a deep breath, cupped her hands around her mouth, and shouted, "Sarah!" The group waited in anticipation. A few seconds later, the echo returned, but it wasn't a simple repetition of Sarah's name. Instead, a whispered voice came back saying, "Hello, Sarah. Welcome." The tourists gasped in amazement. Sarah's eyes widened and she turned to Tom, her mouth agape. How is that possible?" Tom shrugged, maintaining his facade of mystified tour guide. "That's the miracle of it, Sarah. We don't know how it's possible, but it happens every time." Over the next hour, Tom guided each member of the group through their own personal experience with the echo. Each time the response was different, personal, and utterly inexplicable by normal acoustic principles. As the tour concluded and the group made their way back up to the rim, the air was buzzing with excitement. Tom overheard snippets of conversation. "I've never experienced anything like it." "Do you think it's some kind of hidden technology?" "Maybe it's spirits of the canyon. My great-grandmother was Native American and she used to tell stories." Tom smiled to himself, but the unease in his gut grew. He knew the truth was far stranger and potentially more dangerous than any of their theories. As he bid farewell to the group at the visitor center, a man approached him. The press badge on his chest identified him as Michael Stanton from the Arizona Daily Sun. "Mr. Reeves?" the reporter asked, extending his hand. "I was wondering if I could have a word with you about this miracle echo phenomenon." Tom hesitated for a moment before shaking the man's hand. "Sure, Mr. Stanton. What would you like to know?" The reporter pulled out a notepad. "How did you discover this unusual echo, and what do you think is causing it?" Tom chose his words carefully. "I stumbled upon it during a routine tour about 3 weeks ago. As for what's causing it, your guess is as good as mine. It's a true mystery of nature." Michael scribbled in his notepad. "And you're certain it's not some kind of hoax or hidden technology?" Tom shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. I've been guiding tours in this canyon for over a decade. I know every inch of that area. There's no technology involved, just the raw power of nature." The interview continued for several more minutes, with Tom walking a fine line between promoting the attraction and avoiding any mention of the crevice or the more unsettling aspects of his discovery. As the reporter left, promising a feature article in the Sunday edition, Tom felt a mix of excitement and dread. The publicity would be good for business, but it also meant more scrutiny. He hoped he could keep the true nature of the echo a secret for a while longer, at least until he understood it better himself. That night, as Tom lay in bed, unable to sleep, his mind raced with the implications of what he had set in motion. The echo was no longer just a personal mystery. It was becoming a public sensation, and with that came risks he hadn't fully considered before. He thought back to his conversations with Jake, the young man from the university who had noticed the strange echo that first day. Jake had been helping him research the phenomenon, looking into geological anomalies and local legends that might explain what was happening. So far, they had found nothing conclusive, but Jake's enthusiasm hadn't waned. Tom reached for his phone and dialed Jake's number, not caring about the late hour. "Hello?" Jake's voice was groggy with sleep. "Jake, it's Tom. Sorry to wake you, but we need to talk. Things are moving faster than I anticipated." Jake's voice immediately sharpened. "What's going on? Did something happen at the crevice?" Tom sighed. "No, not exactly. But a reporter interviewed me today. There's going to be a newspaper article about the echo. We need to be prepared for what might come next." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You think this might draw unwanted attention, like government attention?" "I don't know," Tom admitted. "But we need to be careful. I think it's time we brought in some expert help. Do you still have that contact in the geology department?" "Dr. Chen? Yeah, I can reach out to her. But Tom, are you sure about this? Once we involve more people, we can't control where this goes." Tom closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision. "I know, Jake, but we're in over our heads here. Whatever is happening in that canyon, it's beyond our understanding. We need help." As he hung up the phone, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to take a leap into the unknown. The echo that had once been a curiosity, then a profitable attraction, was now threatening to become something much bigger and potentially more dangerous. Outside his window, the stars twinkled over the dark silhouette of the canyon. Somewhere out there in the depths of the rock, something was waiting. Something that knew his name, that could mimic voices, that seemed to hunger for human contact. And Tom had just invited the world to come and listen. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Tom's dreams were filled with whispers echoing through endless canyons, calling his name, beckoning him deeper into the earth. The adventure that had begun with a simple echo was about to become a journey beyond anything he could have imagined. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Tom arrived at the canyon rim, his mind still foggy from another restless night. The article in the Arizona Daily Sun had hit newsstands yesterday, and already the impact was palpable. His phone had been ringing off the hook with tour requests, and he'd spotted several unfamiliar faces lurking around the visitor center, all carrying sophisticated audio equipment. As Tom made his way down the now familiar path to the echo chamber, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The canyon seemed different today, more alive somehow, as if it was holding its breath in anticipation. He had just reached the plateau when a voice behind him made him jump. "Mr. Reeves?" Tom spun around to find an elderly Native American man standing there, his weathered face etched with deep lines of wisdom and concern. Despite the warm morning, the man wore a thick blanket draped over his shoulders, adorned with intricate tribal patterns. "Yes, that's me," Tom replied, trying to mask his surprise. "I'm sorry, but the tour doesn't start for another hour." The old man shook his head slowly. "I'm not here for your tour, Mr. Reeves. I'm here to warn you." A chill ran down Tom's spine despite the growing heat of the day. "Warn me? About what?" The man took a step closer, his dark eyes boring into Tom's. "About the voices you've awakened, the spirits that dwell in the depths of this sacred place." Tom's heart began to race. He glanced around nervously, making sure they were alone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's expression hardened. "Do not play games with me, young man. I know what you've done. I can feel the disturbance in the air, the shifting of ancient energies. You've opened a door that was meant to stay closed. For a moment, Tom considered denying everything, but the certainty in the old man's eyes made him reconsider. He sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am Joseph Whitecloud, an elder of the Havasupai tribe. Our people have been the guardians of this canyon for countless generations. We know its secrets, its power, and its dangers." Tom's mind raced. Here, finally, was someone who might have answers. "Mr. Whitecloud, please, I need to understand what's happening here. The voices, the strange echoes. What are they?" Joseph's eyes softened slightly, seeing the genuine confusion and fear in Tom's face. "They are the whispers of the ancients, spirits trapped between worlds. Long ago, they were sealed away by our ancestors to protect both their world and ours. But now, you have given them a voice, a way to reach out." Tom felt a wave of guilt wash over him. I didn't know. I thought it was just some strange acoustic phenomenon. I never meant to." "Intentions matter little in the face of such power," Joseph interrupted. "What's done is done. But it is not too late to undo the damage, to close the door you've opened." Hope flared in Tom's chest. "How? Tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it." Joseph shook his head sadly. "It is not that simple. The spirits have tasted freedom. They have made contact with your world. They will not go quietly back into the darkness." A gust of wind suddenly whipped through the canyon, carrying with it a faint whisper that made both men shiver. "Tom, help us." Joseph's eyes widened. "They know you. They have chosen you as their conduit." Tom felt his knees go weak. He sank to the ground, his head spinning. What does that mean? What do they want from me? The old man knelt beside him, placing a gnarled hand on Tom's shoulder. "They want what all trapped beings want, freedom. But their freedom would come at a terrible cost. The barrier between worlds would be shattered, and chaos would reign." Tom looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "Then we have to stop them. There must be a way to seal them back up, to undo what I've started." Joseph nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it requires great sacrifice. Are you willing to pay that price, Mr. Reeves?" Before Tom could answer, the sound of voices and footsteps echoed from further up the path. His tour group was arriving early, eager to experience the miracle echo for themselves. Joseph stood quickly. "I must go. They cannot see me here. But heed my warning, Tom Reeves. Stop this madness before it's too late, for all our sakes." With surprising agility for his age, the old man disappeared behind a large boulder, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts and the approaching tourists. As Tom stood to greet his group, plastering on his tour guide's smile, his mind was in turmoil. The weight of Joseph's words pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had started all of this out of curiosity and a desire for profit, but now he realized he had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. The tour proceeded as usual, with gasps of amazement and excited chatter as each person experienced their personalized echo. But for Tom, each response from the canyon was now tinged with dread. He could hear the hunger in the whispers, the desperation, and underneath it all, a malevolence that he had been too blind to notice before. As the group made their way back up to the rim, Tom's decision was made. He would have to shut this down, no matter the cost to his business or reputation. But first, he needed more information. That night, as Tom lay in bed, his dreams were more vivid and terrifying than ever before. He found himself wandering through endless caverns deep within the earth, following whispers that always seemed to be just around the next bend. The walls pulsed with an eerie light, and strange symbols like those around the crevice glowed with an inner fire. In his dream, Tom finally reached a vast underground chamber. In the center stood a shimmering portal, beyond which he could see glimpses of another world, a world of darkness and twisted shapes. And emerging from the portal were shadowy figures, reaching out with long, grasping fingers. Tom awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, the echoes of unearthly screams still ringing in his ears. He fumbled for his phone, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness. It was 3:27 a.m. With shaking fingers, he dialed Jake's number. "Tom?" Jake's voice was thick with sleep. "What's going on? It's the middle of the night." "Jake, I need you to listen carefully," Tom said, his voice urgent. "We need to shut down the tours, all of them, and we need to find out everything we can about the Havasupai tribe's legends about the canyon." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Tom, are you okay? Did something happen?" Tom took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I met someone today, Jake. Someone who knows what's really going on with the Echo. And if he's right, we've stumbled into something far more dangerous than we ever imagined." As Tom filled Jake in on his conversation with Joseph Whitecloud and his vivid nightmare, he could feel a sense of resolve settling over him. Whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice required, he knew he had to find a way to close the door he had unwittingly opened. The grand adventure that had started with a simple echo had now become a race against time to save not just the canyon, but perhaps the entire world from an ancient and terrible threat. The morning sun had barely begun to warm the red rocks of the Grand Canyon when Tom arrived at the visitor center. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but there was a determined set to his jaw. He had spent the early hours of the morning making calls, canceling tours, and issuing refunds. Now, he stood before a small crowd of disappointed tourists, trying to explain the situation without causing panic. "I'm sorry, folks, but due to unforeseen circumstances, all tours to the Echo Chamber have been suspended indefinitely," Tom announced, his voice carrying across the restless group. A middle-aged woman in a floral sun hat pushed to the front. "But we came all the way from Florida for this. The paper said it was a miracle." Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I understand your frustration, ma'am. We're dealing with some unexpected geological instabilities in the area. It's simply not safe at the moment." As the crowd grumbled and dispersed, Tom felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Jake standing there, looking as tired as Tom felt. "Hey," Jake said, his voice low. "I did some digging like you asked. Found some pretty wild stuff in the university library about Havasupai legends. We should talk somewhere private." Tom nodded, relief washing over him at the sight of his young friend. "Yeah, good idea. Let's head to my office." As they made their way to the small, cluttered room Tom used as his base of operations, neither man noticed the lone figure that detached itself from the lingering tourists and began to follow them at a discreet distance. Once inside the office, Tom closed the door and turned to Jake. "All right, what did you find?" Jake pulled out a thick folder stuffed with photocopied pages and handwritten notes. "It's pretty intense, Tom. The Havasupai have stories going back centuries about a place they call the Whisper Caves. According to their legends, it's a portal to the spirit world, guarded by ancient beings they call the Shadow Walkers." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "Shadow Walkers? That sounds an awful lot like what I saw in my dream." Jake nodded grimly. "Gets worse. The legends say that every few generations the barrier between worlds grows thin and the Shadow Walkers try to break through. They use the voices of the living to lure people into the caves, growing stronger with each soul they trap." Tom sank into his chair, his face pale. "My God, Jake, what have we done? We've been leading people right to them." Before Jake could respond, there was a knock at the door. Tom and Jake exchanged a wary glance before Tom called out, "Who is it?" "Mr. Reeves, it's Sarah Chen from the geology department. Jake asked me to come." Tom shot Jake a questioning look, and the younger man nodded. "I called her last night after we talked. Figured we could use some scientific expertise." Tom stood and opened the door, revealing a petite Asian woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Dr. Chen, thank you for coming. Please come in." As Sarah entered the office, her eyes widened at the sight of the scattered papers and maps. "Looks like you boys have been busy." Jake gave me a brief overview, but I have to say it all sounds a bit far-fetched. Tom smiled wryly. Believe me, I wish it was. But after what I've seen and heard, I'm willing to consider even the most outlandish explanations. For the next hour, the three of them pored over Jake's research and Tom's experiences, with Sarah offering geological insights and scientific skepticism in equal measure. As they talked, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the usual bustle of the visitor center grew louder outside. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the hallway. Tom opened the door to find a park ranger looking frantic. "Tom, thank God you're here. We've got a situation," the ranger said, his voice tight with worry. "What's going on, Steve?" Tom asked, dread settling in his stomach. "It's one of the tourists from this morning's canceled tour, a young woman. She apparently snuck off down the trail towards the echo chamber. Her friends just reported her missing." Tom felt the blood drain from his face. "How long ago?" Steve checked his watch. "They last saw her about 2 hours ago. We're organizing a search party now." Tom turned to Jake and Sarah, his expression grim. "I have to go. You two stay here, keep working on finding a solution." Sarah stood, her scientific skepticism replaced by determination. "No way. If there's a missing person, you'll need all the help you can get. I'm coming with you." Jake nodded in agreement. "Me too. We're in this together now." Tom wanted to argue, to protect them from whatever dangers might be lurking in the canyon, but he knew they were right. They needed all hands on deck. Within minutes, they had joined the growing search party at the trailhead. Park rangers were handing out water bottles and maps, organizing the volunteers into groups. Tom, Jake, and Sarah found themselves in a team with Steve and 2 other experienced hikers. As they set off down the familiar path, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The canyon seemed different now, more ominous. The shadows seemed deeper, the echoes of their footsteps more pronounced. They had been searching for nearly an hour, calling out the missing woman's name, Emily, when they reached the plateau of the echo chamber. Tom held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. "Let me try something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Taking a deep breath, Tom called out, "Emily, are you here?" For a long moment, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind through the canyon. Then, faintly at first but growing stronger, came a response. "Help me. Tom, help me." The voice was Emily's, but there was something off about it, an undercurrent of something ancient and malevolent that made Tom's skin crawl. Sarah gasped, her scientific mind struggling to process what she had just heard. That's impossible. The acoustics don't work that way." Jake put a hand on her shoulder. "Welcome to our world, Dr. Chen." Steve was already radioing for backup, his voice shaky as he reported the development. The other 2 hikers looked around nervously, clearly spooked by the unnatural echo. Tom took a step towards the canyon wall where he knew the hidden crevice lay. "Emily, if you can hear me, stay where you are. We're coming to get you." The response came immediately, louder this time. "Come, join us, Tom. We're waiting for you." A cold wind blew through the plateau, carrying with it the sound of many whispers, a cacophony of voices calling out in desperation and hunger. Tom turned to the group, his face set with grim determination. "I have to go in after her. The rest of you stay here and wait for backup." Jake stepped forward. "No way, Tom, you're not going in there alone." Sarah nodded, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. "I'm coming too. Whatever's happening here, it's beyond anything in our current understanding of geology or physics. I need to see it for myself." Steve looked torn, but finally nodded. "All right, but I'm coming with you. The other 2 can stay here and guide the backup team when they arrive." As the 4 of them approached the hidden crevice, Tom felt a sense of finality settle over him. He knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that once they stepped through that opening, nothing would ever be the same again. "Everyone ready?" he asked, looking at each of his companions in turn. They nodded, fear and determination mingling in their eyes. Tom took a deep breath and stepped towards the crevice. "All right then, Let's go find Emily. And maybe save the world while we're at it. As they squeezed through the narrow opening, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The adventure that had begun with a simple echo was about to become a journey into the heart of an ancient mystery, with the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance. The fluorescent lights of the Grand Canyon National Park's ranger station buzzed incessantly, adding to the tension that filled the small room. Tom Reeves sat in an uncomfortable metal chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he faced the stern-faced park superintendent and two grim-looking police detectives. "Mr. Reeves," the superintendent began, his voice heavy with concern and a hint of accusation. "I need you to walk us through everything that happened yesterday. Leave nothing out." Tom took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. The events of the previous day seemed like a blur, a nightmare he couldn't quite shake off. "We entered the crevice," he began, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Me, Jake, Dr. Chen, and Ranger Steve. We were following the voice, Emily's voice." Detective Harris, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. "And you're certain it was Ms. Emily Thornton's voice you heard?" Tom nodded slowly. "Yes, and no. It sounded like her, but there was something off about it, something unnatural." The second detective, a younger woman named Rodriguez, raised an eyebrow. "Unnatural how, Mr. Reeves?" Tom struggled to find the right words. It was like her voice was layered with others, whispers underneath, saying things I couldn't quite make out. The superintendent exchanged a skeptical glance with the detectives. "Mr. Reeves, I hope you understand how this sounds." "I know how it sounds," Tom said, an edge of frustration creeping into his voice. "But it's the truth. Ask Jake or Dr. Chen. They heard it too." Detective Harris consulted his notes. "We'll be speaking with them shortly. Please continue. What happened after you entered the crevice?" Tom closed his eyes, recalling the eerie journey into the depths of the canyon. The passage was narrow at first, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through single file. But then it opened up into a larger cavern. The walls, they were covered in those strange symbols I told you about before. "And did you recognize any of these symbols?" Rodriguez asked. Tom shook his head. "No, nothing I'd ever seen before. Dr. Chen was fascinated by them. She said they didn't match any known Native American petroglyphs." The superintendent interjected, "And where was Ranger Steve during all this?" A pang of guilt shot through Tom's chest. "He was with us, taking the lead. He had the most caving experience." "Go on," Harris prompted. "We kept following the voice, deeper into the cave system. The air got colder, damper, and the whispers, they were getting louder. Not just Emily's voice anymore, but others. Dozens, maybe hundreds of voices all calling out." Tom paused, shuddering at the memory. The room had grown eerily quiet, the three officials hanging on his every word, despite their obvious skepticism. "That's when we found the chamber," Tom continued. "A massive cavern, bigger than anything that should exist in this part of the canyon. And in the center," he trailed off, the image seared into his mind. "In the center of what, Mr. Reeves?" Rodriguez pressed. Tom looked up, meeting their eyes. "A pool of something, not water. It was dark, shifting, like living shadows, and the voices were coming from it." The superintendent leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Reeves, do you realize how fantastical this all sounds?" "I do," Tom admitted. "But I'm telling you the truth. Ask the others. They saw it too." Harris cleared his throat. "And Miss Thornton? Did you find any trace of her?" Tom's face fell. "No, not then. We searched the chamber, called out for her, but there was no sign of her. That's when it happened." "When what happened?" Rodriguez asked, leaning forward. "The shadows. They moved, rose up out of the pool like tentacles. Steve was closest. They grabbed him before any of us could react, pulled him in. 1 second he was there, the next. Tom's voice broke, the horror of the moment overwhelming him. The room was silent for a long moment before the superintendent spoke, his voice softer now. Mr. Reeves, Tom, I've known you for years. You're not the type to make up stories or play pranks, but what you're describing, it's impossible. Tom looked up, his eyes blazing with a mix of fear and determination. I know how it sounds, but it's real, and it's still down there. Whatever that thing is, it has Emily and Steve, and it wants more. Detective Harris sighed heavily. All right, Mr. Reeves, we appreciate your cooperation. We'll need you to remain available for further questioning, and I strongly advise against speaking to the press about any of this. As Tom stood to leave, Detective Rodriguez placed a hand on his arm. One more thing, Mr. Reeves. These voices you heard, did they say anything specific? Anything that might help us understand what's going on? Tom hesitated, then nodded slowly. They kept repeating one phrase over and over. The door is open. The shadows will walk. With that ominous statement hanging in the air, Tom left the ranger station. Outside, he found Jake and Dr. Chen waiting for him, both looking as haggard and shell-shocked as he felt. How'd it go? Jake asked, his usual enthusiasm dampened by the events of the past day. Tom shook his head. About as well as you'd expect. They think we're either crazy or hiding something. Dr. Chen spoke up, her scientific curiosity seemingly undiminished by their ordeal. We need to go back, Tom, with proper equipment this time. If what we saw is real, it could rewrite everything we know about geology, physics, maybe even the nature of reality itself. Tom stared at her in disbelief. Go back? Sarah, 2 people are missing, possibly dead, and that thing down there is still active. We can't risk more lives. Jake stepped between them, his voice low and urgent. Guys, we've got company. Tom turned to see a group of reporters approaching, cameras and microphones at the ready. At their head was Michael Stanton, the journalist who had written the original article about the Miracle Echo. Mr. Reeves, Stanton called out, can you comment on the disappearances? Is it true that the famous echo is connected to some kind of underground cave system? Tom held up a hand, trying to ward off the press. No comment. Please respect the privacy of the families involved. As they pushed through the crowd of reporters, Tom's mind raced. He knew the story was too big to contain now. Soon the whole world would be focused on the Grand Canyon and the mystery beneath it. What do we do now? Jake asked as they reached Tom's Jeep. Tom looked at his 2 companions, then out at the vast expanse of the canyon. Somewhere out there, beyond the tourist trails and park boundaries, an ancient evil was stirring, and they were the only ones who knew the truth. We do what we have to, Tom said, his voice filled with grim determination. We find a way to close that door, whatever it takes, because if we don't, I have a feeling those shadows won't stay in the canyon for long. As they drove away from the ranger station, the setting sun cast long shadows across the canyon, shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The investigation had only just begun, and Tom knew that the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Tom's Jeep pulled up to the small, nondescript building on the outskirts of Flagstaff. The sign on the door read, Dr. Sarah Chen, geological consultant. But Tom knew that her expertise extended far beyond the realm of rocks and minerals. As they climbed out of the vehicle, Jake stretched his lanky frame, yawning widely. Remind me again why we're here at the crack of dawn? Tom's eyes were fixed on the building, his expression a mixture of hope and trepidation. Because Dr. Chen might be our only chance of understanding what we're dealing with, and because time is running out. They approached the door, and Tom raised his hand to knock, but before he could, it swung open. Dr. Chen stood there, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, eyes bright despite the early hour. You're late, she said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I've been up all night analyzing the data we collected. You're going to want to see this. She ushered them inside, leading them through a cluttered office space to a back room that looked more like a high-tech laboratory than a geologist's workspace. Computers hummed and various instruments blinked and whirred. "I thought you were just a consultant," Jake said, eyes wide as he took in the advanced equipment. Sarah shot him a wry grin. "I moonlight in some, let's say, less conventional areas of research. It helps to have the right tools." She led them to a large screen displaying a 3D model of the cave system they had explored. Tom felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the twisting passages and the vast chamber where they had encountered the shadow entity. "I've been running simulations based on the scans we took," Sarah explained, her fingers flying over a keyboard. "And I've discovered something extraordinary." The image on the screen zoomed in on the central chamber, focusing on the pool of shifting darkness they had seen. Sarah tapped a few more keys, and suddenly the model was overlaid with swirling lines of energy, pulsing and flowing around the pool. "What are we looking at?" Tom asked, leaning in closer. Sarah's voice was filled with a mixture of excitement and awe. "Energy readings unlike anything I've ever seen before. It's as if that chamber is a nexus point for some kind of, well, for lack of a better term, interdimensional energy." Jake whistled low. "Interdimensional? You mean like other worlds?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Potentially. The readings suggest a thinning of the barriers between realities. It's theoretical physics made manifest." Tom ran a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. "And the voices? The shadows? How do they fit into all this?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "That's where things get even stranger. I've been analyzing the audio recordings we made and, well, see for yourself." She pulled up a new window displaying a complex waveform. As she hit play, the eerie whispers they had heard in the cave filled the room. But now, with the audio enhanced and cleaned up, Tom could make out words and phrases he hadn't noticed before. "The veil thins. The hunger grows. Feed up. Release us." Sarah paused the playback. "There are dozens of distinct voices layered here, some speaking languages I can't even identify, but they all seem to be saying variations on the same theme." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. They want out. Whatever these things are, they're trapped on the other side of that barrier, and they're trying to break through. Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Wait a second, go back to that 3D model." Sarah obliged, bringing the cave system back up on the screen. Jake pointed to a section of the tunnel just before it opened into the main chamber. "There. Zoom in on that." As the image magnified, they all leaned in closer. There, etched into the walls of the passage, were symbols similar to the ones they had seen throughout the cave. "I knew those looked familiar," Jake said, excitement creeping into his voice. "They're not just random markings. They're a language." Tom turned to him, eyebrows raised. "How do you know that?" Jake grinned sheepishly. "I may have spent some time in the rare book section of the university library. There's an old text there, supposedly translated from an even older Native American source. It talks about a shadow tongue used to communicate with spirits." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Jake, that's brilliant. If we can decipher these symbols, we might be able to understand what's really going on down there." Tom, however, looked less enthusiastic. "That's all fascinating, but we're running out of time. Emily and Steve are still missing, and for all we know, that thing down there could be getting stronger by the minute." Sarah put a hand on his arm, her expression softening. "I know you're worried, Tom. We all are. But rushing in unprepared won't help anyone. We need to understand what we're dealing with if we're going to have any chance of stopping it." Tom nodded reluctantly. "You're right. So what's our next move?" Sarah turned back to her computers, fingers flying over the keyboard once more. "I'm going to keep analyzing this data, see if I can find any weaknesses or patterns in the energy fluctuations. Jake, I want you to dig deeper into that text you found. Any information about the shadow tongue could be crucial." "What about me?" Tom asked, feeling a bit lost among the scientific jargon and ancient mysteries. Sarah fixed him with a steady gaze. You have the most important job of all, Tom. You need to go back to the canyon. Tom's eyes widened. Back? But I thought we agreed it was too dangerous. Sarah nodded grimly. It is dangerous. But you have a connection to that place now, whether you like it or not. The voices responded to you. And if we're going to find a way to close this interdimensional rift, we need someone on the inside, observing and reporting back. Tom felt a weight settle in his chest, a mixture of fear and determination. All right, I'll do it. But how am I supposed to get past the police and park rangers? The whole area is probably crawling with them by now. A sly smile spread across Sarah's face. Leave that to me. I have a few connections in the Park Service. I can get you temporary credentials as a geological survey assistant. It won't fool everyone, but it should get you past the initial checkpoints. As Sarah began making calls and Jake buried himself in his research notes, Tom found himself staring out the window at the distant silhouette of the Grand Canyon. Somewhere out there, in the depths of the earth, an ancient evil was stirring, and he was about to walk right back into its lair. Hey! Jake's voice pulled him from his thoughts. You okay? Tom turned to his young friend, forcing a smile. Yeah, just processing everything, I guess. Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's a lot to take in. But we're going to figure this out, Tom. We're going to save Emily and Steve, and we're going to close that door before anything else can come through. Tom wished he could share Jake's optimism, but as he looked back out at the canyon, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the precipice of something far bigger and more terrifying than any of them could imagine. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape, Tom steeled himself for the journey ahead. Whatever awaited him in the depths of the canyon, he knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Grand Canyon as Tom made his way down the now familiar trail to the echo chamber. His geological survey assistant badge hung around his neck, a flimsy disguise that had nonetheless gotten him past the increased security at the park entrance. As he approached the plateau, Tom felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The once bustling tourist spot was eerily quiet, cordoned off with yellow police tape. He ducked under it, his eyes fixed on the narrow crevice that led to the underground chamber. Tom's radio crackled to life, making him jump. Sarah's voice came through, tinged with static. Tom, are you there? Have you reached the site? He pressed the talk button. Just got here, it's unsettling. The whole place feels wrong somehow. Be careful, Sarah's voice warned. The energy readings I'm getting are off the charts. Whatever's down there, it's more active than ever. Tom took a deep breath, steeling himself. Understood. I'm going in. As he squeezed through the narrow opening, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The passageway seemed darker than before, the air thicker and harder to breathe. He switched on his headlamp, the beam cutting through the gloom. The symbols on the wall seemed to writhe in the flickering light, almost as if they were alive. Tom ran his hand over one, feeling a strange vibration beneath his fingers. Jake, he spoke into the radio. You there? I'm seeing those symbols again. They're different somehow. More active. Jake's excited voice crackled through. Really? That's fascinating. I've been making progress with the translation. It's not a complete language, more like a code. Each symbol represents a concept rather than a specific word. Tom moved deeper into the cave, his unease growing with each step. What kind of concepts? Mostly abstract stuff, Jake replied. Darkness, hunger, freedom. But there's one that keeps repeating. It translates roughly to the thinning. A chill ran down Tom's spine. The thinning? As in, the barrier between worlds? That's my guess, Jake confirmed. Tom, be careful down there. If these symbols are active like you say, it could mean the barrier is weakening. As Tom entered the main chamber, he gasped. The pool of darkness at the center had grown, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Tendrils of shadow writhed at its edges, reaching out into the air. "Sarah," Tom whispered into the radio, "are you seeing this?" "The readings are off the charts," Sarah's voice came back, tense with excitement and fear. "Tom, the energy levels are spiking. Something's happening." As if in response to her words, the pool of darkness began to churn. A low rumbling sound filled the chamber, and Tom felt the ground trembling beneath his feet. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the cave, not from his radio, but from the pool itself. It was a cacophony of whispers, all speaking in unison. "The door opens. The shadows will walk." Tom stumbled backward, his heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" "We heard it," Sarah confirmed, her voice shaking. "Tom, get out of there now." But Tom couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the pool where a shape was beginning to form. It rose from the darkness, a towering figure of living shadow. And then, to Tom's horror, it spoke, with Emily's voice. "Tom, is that you? Please, help me." Tom's breath caught in his throat. "Emily? My God, is that really you?" The shadow figure shifted, and for a moment Tom could almost see Emily's features in its fluid form. "It's me, Tom, but I'm not alone. There are others here. So many others. We're trapped, Tom. You have to help us." Tom took a step forward, drawn by the plea in Emily's voice. "How? Tell me what to do." The figure reached out a tendril of darkness. "Just take my hand, Tom. Join us. Together we can open the door fully. We can be free." Tom's hand rose almost of its own accord. He could hear Sarah and Jake shouting through the radio, warning him to stop, but their voices seemed distant, unimportant. Just as his fingers were about to touch the shadow, a new voice rang out through the chamber. "Tom Reeves, step away from that thing." Tom whirled around to see Joseph Whitecloud, the Havasupai elder, standing at the entrance to the chamber. The old man's eyes blazed with an inner fire, and in his hand he held what looked like an ancient staff adorned with feathers and crystals. "That is not your friend," Joseph said, his voice filled with power. "It is a deceiver, a shadow that wears the faces of those we've lost to lure us in." The shadow figure hissed, its form rippling. "Do not listen to him, Tom. He would keep us trapped here forever." Joseph strode forward, raising his staff. "I am the guardian of the seal, appointed by my ancestors to keep the shadow world at bay. The barrier must hold, or both our worlds will be consumed by darkness." Tom's mind reeled, torn between the pleading voice of Emily and the commanding presence of Joseph. I don't understand. What is this place? What's really going on here?" Joseph's eyes softened slightly. "This chamber is a nexus point, a place where the veil between worlds grows thin. My people have guarded it for generations, using our ancient knowledge to keep the shadows at bay. But now, thanks to your meddling, the seal is weakening." The shadow figure lunged forward suddenly, its form expanding to fill the chamber. "Enough. The time of guardians is over. The shadows will walk again." Joseph raised his staff, shouting words in a language Tom didn't recognize. A burst of light erupted from the crystals, pushing the darkness back. "Tom!" Joseph called out. "You must choose. Help me reinforce the seal, or doom both our worlds to eternal darkness." The shadow tendrils whipped around Tom, Emily's voice pleading in his ear. "Please, Tom, don't leave me here. Don't abandon me to the darkness." Tom closed his eyes, his heart pounding. In that moment he saw flashes of memory, the wonder of discovering the echo, the thrill of unraveling the mystery, the horror of the disappearances. And beneath it all, a growing understanding of the true nature of the force they had awakened. He opened his eyes, resolve hardening his features. "I'm sorry, Emily," he whispered, "but you're not really her, and I won't let you destroy our world." Tom turned to Joseph, extending his hand. "Tell me what to do." Joseph nodded gravely, grasping Tom's hand with surprising strength. "Focus your will. Picture the barrier between worlds as a great wall, We must rebuild it stone by stone. As Tom concentrated, he felt a surge of energy flowing through him. The shadow figure howled in rage, its tendrils lashing out, but they seemed to bounce off an invisible shield surrounding Tom and Joseph. The chamber filled with light, pulsing in rhythm with Tom's heartbeat. He could feel the barrier taking shape in his mind, a shimmering wall of energy pushing back against the encroaching darkness. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the shadow figure collapsed in on itself, drawn back into the pool of darkness. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, then faded to dull etchings in the rock. Tom fell to his knees, exhausted. Joseph leaned heavily on his staff, his weathered face etched with fatigue but also triumph. "It is done," the old man said. "The seal is restored, stronger than before. But this is not the end, Tom Reeves. It is only the beginning." As Tom looked around the now quiet chamber, he knew Joseph was right. They had won a battle, but the war against the shadows was far from over. And somewhere out there, in the space between worlds, Emily and Steve were still lost. Tom stood, a new determination filling him. "Then let's get to work. We have a lot to do, and not much time to do it." As they made their way out of the chamber, Tom's radio crackled to life. Sarah and Jake's voices came through, full of questions and concern. Tom smiled grimly. He had a lot to tell them, and even more to learn. The mystery of the Grand Canyon's echo had been solved, but a far greater adventure was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of the makeshift command center hummed incessantly, casting a harsh glow over the faces of those gathered around the large map of the Grand Canyon spread across the table. Tom Reeves stood at the head, his eyes sunken with exhaustion but burning with determination. To his right, Dr. Sarah Chen pored over a laptop displaying complex energy readings. On his left, Jake furiously scribbled notes, cross-referencing ancient texts with modern geological surveys. "All right, let's recap," Tom said, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. "In the past week, we've had 3 more disappearances in the canyon, all in different locations, but all exhibiting the same phenomenon. Voices luring people off the marked trails." Sarah looked up from her laptop, pushing her glasses up her nose. "And the energy readings at each site are consistent with what we saw in the echo chamber. It's like the barrier is thinning in multiple places now." Jake nodded, tapping his pen against his notebook. "The symbols are showing up in new locations too. I've been working with some linguistics professors, and we think we've cracked more of the code. It's not good news." Tom braced himself. "Let's hear it." Jake cleared his throat. "Well, remember how we thought the thinning referred to the barrier between worlds? We were right, but it's worse than we thought. The full phrase translates roughly to the Great Thinning. It's not just about our world and theirs. It's about the fabric of reality itself." A heavy silence fell over the room. Tom broke it, his voice tight. "What does that mean exactly?" Sarah stepped in, her scientific mind already racing. "If I'm understanding correctly, it means the boundary between all possible realities is weakening. Not just here, but potentially everywhere." "And if it fails completely?" Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Chaos," Jake said simply. "A collapse of all realities into one. The end of everything as we know it." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Tom ran a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. "Okay, so how do we stop it?" Before anyone could answer, the door burst open. Joseph Whitecloud strode in, his weathered face grave. "We may already be too late." All eyes turned to the Havasupai elder. Tom stepped forward. "What do you mean, Joseph? What's happened?" Joseph pulled a small, intricately carved stone from his pocket. As he set it on the table, Tom could see strange symbols etched into its surface, symbols that matched those in the cave. "This is an ancient warning stone, passed down through generations of my people," Joseph explained. "It's tied to the energies of the seal. When it glows, it means the barrier is under attack." Sarah leaned in, Her scientific curiosity piqued. Fascinating. Some kind of quantum entanglement, perhaps? Joseph shot her a wry smile. We simply call it magic, Dr. Chen. But the how matters less than the what. And right now, this stone is telling us that the seal is failing, and failing fast. As if to emphasize his point, the stone began to pulse with an eerie light. A low humming filled the room, setting everyone's teeth on edge. Tom's radio crackled to life. Mr. Reeves, this is Ranger Martinez. We've got a situation developing at Plateau Point. Multiple reports of strange phenomena, voices, shadows moving where they shouldn't. We need you here ASAP. Tom grabbed the radio. Copy that, Martinez, we're on our way. He turned to the group. All right, people, this is it. Whatever's coming, it's starting now. Sarah, Jake, grab whatever equipment you think we'll need. Joseph, I need you with us. Your knowledge might be our only edge. As they scrambled to gather supplies, Tom pulled Sarah aside. What about your energy dampening device? Is it ready? Sarah bit her lip. It's untested, Tom. In theory, it should be able to stabilize the energy fluctuations around a localized tear in the barrier, but I have no idea what kind of effect it'll have on a larger scale. Tom nodded grimly. Bring it anyway. At this point, we need every tool we can get. Within minutes, they were piled into Tom's jeep, racing towards Plateau Point. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the canyon, shadows that seemed to move and writhe with a life of their own. As they neared their destination, Tom could see a crowd gathered at the viewpoint. Park rangers were trying to maintain order, but panic was clearly setting in. And beyond the railing, out over the vast expanse of the canyon, a sight that made Tom's blood run cold. A massive, swirling vortex of darkness hung in the air, easily 100 feet across. Tendrils of shadow reached out from its center, grasping at the air like hungry fingers. And from within, a cacophony of voices called out, some pleading, some threatening, all filled with an otherworldly hunger. My God, Sarah breathed as they pulled up. It's a full-scale breach. Joseph was already out of the jeep, his staff raised. The seal has broken, the shadows are coming through. As if in response to his words, a figure began to emerge from the vortex. It was vaguely humanoid, but composed entirely of writhing darkness. As it touched down on the viewing platform, tourists screamed and ran. Tom stepped forward, placing himself between the crowd and the shadow being. Everyone stay back! Rangers, get these people out of here! The shadow figure turned its featureless face towards Tom. When it spoke, it was with a voice he recognized all too well. Tom, is that you? It was Steve's voice, the missing ranger. Please help us. It's so dark here, so cold. Tom felt his resolve waver for a moment, but he steeled himself. You're not Steve. We've played this game before, remember? The figure's form rippled, and suddenly it was Emily standing before him. Tom, please. You have to believe me. We found a way out, but we need your help to fully cross over. Just take my hand. Sarah's voice cut through Tom's hesitation. Tom, don't listen. It's trying to manipulate you again. The Emily figure's face contorted with rage. Silence! It lashed out with a tendril of darkness, knocking Sarah off her feet. Sarah! Tom cried out, rushing to her side. She was dazed but conscious. Jake helped her up, his face pale with fear but set with determination. Tom, we need to use the dampener. It's our only shot. Tom nodded, turning back to face the shadow being. It was growing larger, drawing power from the vortex behind it. More figures were emerging, each one taking on the form of a missing person. Joseph, Tom called out, can you hold them off while we set up the device? The old man nodded grimly, raising his staff. I will do what I can, but hurry. The barrier weakens with each passing moment. As Joseph began chanting in his native tongue, a shimmering barrier of energy formed between the shadow beings and the humans. The shadows howled in rage, hurling themselves against the magical shield. Tom, Sarah, and Jake worked frantically to set up the energy dampener. It was a hodgepodge of advanced technology and what looked like mystical artifacts. a fusion of science and ancient wisdom. "Okay," Sarah said, her fingers flying over the control panel. "It's ready. But Tom, you should know. This might not just close the portal. It could destroy everything on the other side." Tom's heart clenched. If there was any chance Emily and Steve were still alive over there. But he knew they had no choice. The fate of two worlds hung in the balance. "Do it," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Sarah nodded and pressed the activation button. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, a pulse of energy erupted from the device. The shadow beings screamed, their forms dissolving as the energy wave passed through them. The vortex began to shrink, collapsing in on itself. Joseph's chanting reached a fever pitch, his staff glowing with an inner light. And then, suddenly, it was over. The vortex winked out of existence, taking the shadow beings with it. The unnatural darkness that had fallen over the canyon lifted, replaced by the warm glow of the setting sun. Tom looked around at his companions, Sarah leaning heavily on Jake, both of them wide-eyed with disbelief. Joseph, slumped against a boulder, exhausted but triumphant. Is it over?" Jake asked hesitantly. Joseph shook his head slowly. "No, young one. This was but the first battle in a war that has only just begun. The great thinning is still underway. We have bought ourselves time, nothing more." As rangers and emergency personnel swarmed the area, Tom gazed out over the vast expanse of the Grand Canyon. Somewhere out there, the barrier between worlds was still weakening, and on the other side, unimaginable horrors waited for their chance to break through. Tom squared his shoulders, a new resolve settling over him. They had won this fight. But Joseph was right. The war was far from over. And he knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that he would be on the front lines until the very end. "All right," he said, turning to his team. "Let's get to work. We've got a world to save." The descent into the depths of the Grand Canyon had never felt so ominous. Tom Reeves led the way, his headlamp cutting through the oppressive darkness. Behind him, Dr. Sarah Chen and Jake followed closely, their backpacks laden with scientific equipment and ancient artifacts. Bringing up the rear was Joseph Whitecloud, his weathered hands gripping his staff tightly. The narrow passage they traversed was no longer just a geological formation. It was a threshold between worlds. The walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the air grew thicker with each step they took. "Tom," Sarah's voice broke the tense silence. "The readings are off the charts. Whatever's down there, it's more powerful than anything we've encountered before." Tom nodded grimly. "I can feel it. It's like the very air is alive." Jake, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Guys, look at the walls. The symbols. They're changing." They all paused, shining their lights on the rock face. The strange glyphs that had once been static were now shifting, rearranging themselves before their very eyes. Joseph's eyes widened. "They're responding to our presence. The barrier, it knows we're here." As if in response to his words, a low rumble echoed through the passage. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. "Move!" Tom shouted. "We need to get to the main chamber before—" His words were cut off as the passage behind them collapsed, sending a cloud of dust billowing towards them. They ran, hearts pounding, as the very earth seemed to try to swallow them whole. They burst into the vast chamber just as the last of the passage caved in behind them. As the dust settled, they found themselves face to face with a sight that defied comprehension. The pool of darkness that had once occupied the center of the chamber had expanded, now covering most of the floor. But it was no longer just a pool. It had taken on a three-dimensional form, a swirling vortex that reached towards the ceiling like a malevolent tornado. And within its depths, faces and forms could be seen. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, all reaching out, all calling in a cacophony of whispers. "Tom, Sarah, Jake, help us. Join us. Set us free." Sarah gasped, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It's a confluence of realities. Every possible world, every potential timeline, all converging on this single point. Jake's face had gone pale. And if it fully manifests? Joseph's voice was grim. Then the barriers between all realities will shatter. Chaos will reign, and both our world and theirs will be consumed. Tom stepped forward, his voice raised to be heard over the swirling vortex. We're here to close the breach, to repair the barrier between worlds. The whispers suddenly ceased, replaced by a single booming voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Foolish mortals, you cannot stop what has already begun. The vortex pulsed, and from its depths emerged a figure, or rather, an amalgamation of figures. It was as if every missing person, every lost soul, had been fused into one monstrous entity. Tom's heart clenched as he recognized faces within the shifting mass. Emily, Steve, and others who had vanished into the canyon's depths. The entity spoke again, its voice a chorus of all those it had absorbed. We are the convergence. We are the future. All realities will become one. Sarah was already setting up her equipment, her hands shaking but her voice steady. Tom, we need to activate the resonance disruptor. It should destabilize the energy field maintaining the vortex. Jake moved to help her, but his eyes were fixed on the convergence. But what about all those people? Emily, Steve, are they still in there somewhere? Tom felt torn, the weight of their mission warring with his desire to save those who had been lost. I don't know, but we have to try something. Joseph stepped forward, raising his staff. I will attempt to communicate with the spirits of those trapped within. Perhaps they can fight from the inside while we battle from without. As Joseph began to chant in his native tongue, the convergence let out a roar of fury. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, whipping through the air towards the group. Look out, Tom shouted, diving to push Sarah out of the way of an oncoming tendril. They hit the ground hard, the energy dampener clattering across the stone floor. Jake scrambled to retrieve the device, narrowly avoiding another tendril. We can't get close enough to set it up. Tom's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then his eyes fell on Joseph's staff, glowing with an inner light that seemed to repel the darkness. Joseph, he called out. Your staff? Can it protect us long enough to activate the dampener? The old man nodded, never breaking his chant. He thrust the staff into the ground, and a shimmering barrier of energy expanded outward, pushing back the tendrils of darkness. Now's our chance, Tom yelled. Sarah, Jake, set up the dampener. I'll try to keep it distracted. As Sarah and Jake worked feverishly to prepare the device, Tom stepped as close to the edge of Joseph's barrier as he dared. Hey, he shouted at the convergence. Remember me? Tom Reeves, the guy who first heard your echo. Well, I've got a message for you. This ends now. The entity's attention focused on Tom, its myriad faces contorting with rage. You cannot stop us, Tom Reeves. We are infinite. We are eternal. Maybe, Tom replied, his voice steadier than he felt. But so is the human spirit, and we won't let you destroy our world without a fight. As he spoke, he could see something changing within the convergence. Faces he recognized, Emily, Steve, others, seemed to be pushing their way to the forefront, their expressions clearing as if waking from a dream. Tom? Emily's voice rang out, clearer than the others. Tom, is that really you? Emily, Tom called back, his heart leaping. Yes, it's me. You have to fight it, Emily. All of you. Fight back against the entity controlling you. The convergence writhed, its form destabilizing as the trapped souls within began to resist. No, we are one. You cannot separate us. Now, Sarah, Tom shouted, activate the dampener. Sarah slammed her hand down on the activation switch. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, a pulse of energy erupted from the device. The convergence screamed, a sound of 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The vortex began to collapse in on itself, the faces and forms within being pulled back into the depths. "Emily!" Tom cried out, reaching towards her fading form. "Hold on!" But it was too late. With a final, earth-shaking roar, the vortex imploded. A shockwave of energy blasted through the chamber, knocking them all off their feet. When the dust settled, Tom pushed himself up, ears ringing and vision blurry. The center of the chamber was empty now, the pool of darkness gone. All that remained was a small, shimmering tear in the air, a window between worlds, rapidly shrinking. As Tom watched helpless, he caught a final glimpse through the closing portal. Emily's face, smiling sadly, mouthing words he couldn't hear. And then, with a soft pop, the tear sealed itself, and she was gone. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 4 survivors. They had done it. They had closed the breach, saved their world from the convergence. But at what cost? Tom felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Joseph, his face etched with sympathy and understanding. "You did what had to be done, Tom Reeves," the old man said softly. "You saved countless lives, countless realities." Tom nodded, his throat tight with unshed tears. "But what about those we couldn't save? Emily, Steve, all the others trapped on the other side?" Sarah approached, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes bright with determination. "We'll find a way, Tom. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. We know so much more now. We can keep working, keep searching for a way to bring them back safely." Jake joined them, his youthful optimism shining through despite everything they'd been through. "She's right. We're a team now, and we won't stop until we've saved everyone, in this world and any other." As they made their way out of the chamber, battered but unbowed, Tom felt a glimmer of hope kindle in his chest. The adventure that had begun with a simple echo had become something far greater, a mission to protect not just their world, but all of reality. And as they emerged into the sunlight, the vast expanse of the Grand Canyon spread out before them, Tom knew that their journey was far from over. The echoes of other worlds still whispered on the wind, and somewhere out there, Emily and the others were waiting to be found. "All right, team," Tom said, his voice filled with newfound resolve. "Let's get back to work. We've got a multiverse to save." Tom and Sarah scrambled out of the dark cave, herding the dazed and confused group of rescued people along with them. Their hearts raced as unearthly screeches echoed off the stone walls behind them. "Keep moving," Tom yelled over the cacophony. "Don't look back." Sarah took the lead, her headlamp bobbing as she navigated the twists and turns of the narrow passage. Tom brought up the rear, constantly glancing over his shoulder into the inky darkness. He could sense the malevolent presence of the creature lurking just out of sight. The ground began to tremble beneath their feet. Dirt and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Sarah paused, shining her light upwards with a gasp. Cracks were spiderwebbing through the rock above them. "It's bringing the whole cave down," she cried. "Go, go, go," Tom urged, pushing the stragglers forward. They staggered through the final stretch of tunnel, clambering over boulders as the passage grew increasingly unstable. The thunderous rumble of collapsing rock filled their ears. Finally, they burst out into the open canyon, sucking in lungfuls of crisp night air. Behind them, the cave entrance imploded with a deafening roar, sending up a billowing cloud of dust and debris. They hurled themselves to the ground, shielding their heads as shards of stone flew overhead. After what felt like an eternity, the chaos subsided. Tom and Sarah staggered to their feet amidst the shell-shocked group of survivors. They looked at each other wide-eyed, barely able to believe they had made it out alive. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah asked, doing a quick head count. "Anyone injured?" The rescued individuals checked themselves over, dazed and disoriented, but miraculously unharmed. They began bombarding Tom and Sarah with questions. "What happened to us? How did we get in there? What was that thing? I don't remember anything after hearing that weird echo." Tom held up his hands. Everyone just stay calm. We'll get you back to town and sort everything out. The important thing is you're safe now." As they started the long hike back to civilization, Tom pulled Sarah aside. "They don't remember," he said quietly. "Just like the missing tourist. It's like the creature erases their memories." Sarah glanced back uneasily at the pile of rubble that had once been the cave entrance. "At least it's trapped now. We destroyed its lair." Tom shook his head. "I'm not so sure. I could feel its presence growing stronger the whole time we were down there. I don't think a little rockfall is going to stop it." A gust of wind whistled through the canyon, carrying with it a haunting whisper that raised the hairs on the back of their necks. Tom and Sarah exchanged a look of growing dread. "You don't think," Sarah breathed. "It's free," Tom said grimly. "We released it from its prison, and now it's out there somewhere in the world." They spent the rest of the hike in troubled silence, the weight of their unintended actions hanging heavy on their shoulders. By the time they reached the trailhead parking lot, the eastern sky was turning a pale shade of pre-dawn gray. Tom helped the last of the rescued hikers into the emergency vehicles that were waiting to transport them to the hospital for evaluation. He turned to see Sarah standing at the edge of the lot, staring out over the rugged landscape. He walked over to join her. "Hell of a night," he said wearily. "At least everyone made it out okay." "This time," Sarah replied darkly. "But what about the next? How many more people are going to disappear because of what we did?" "We'll find a way to stop it," Tom said with more conviction than he felt. "We have to." In the distance, an otherworldly sigh seemed to echo across the canyon. Tom and Sarah both shivered. The air felt somehow colder, the shadows a little deeper. A sense of foreboding settled over them like a shroud. Their fight was far from over. It was only just beginning. News of the strange occurrences at the Grand Canyon spread like wildfire. Within days, reports of eerie echoes and disappearances began to flood in from other natural wonders across the country. From the towering redwoods of California to the misty peaks of the Appalachians, the pattern repeated itself with chilling regularity. Tom and Sarah watched the developments with growing unease. They knew all too well the sinister force that lurked behind the seemingly innocuous echoes. The entity they had unwittingly freed from its ancient prison was on the move, leaving a trail of vanished souls in its wake. "We have to do something," Sarah insisted, as they pored over a map of the latest incidents. "We can't just sit here and watch it claim more victims." Tom rubbed his eyes, exhausted from long nights spent scouring online forums and news reports for any scrap of information. "What can we do? We're just two people. This thing is beyond us." "We freed it, Tom. We have a responsibility to try and stop it." "And how do you propose we do that? Chase it across the country? We don't even know what it is, let alone how to fight it." Sarah threw up her hands in frustration. "So we just give up? Let it keep preying on innocent people?" Tom sighed. "No, of course not. I don't know where to start." A heavy silence fell between them. The weight of their guilt and helplessness was suffocating. Finally, Sarah spoke. "We start by figuring out where it's going next. There has to be a pattern to its movements." They threw themselves into the task with renewed determination. They mapped out the locations of the echoes and disappearances, looking for any common threads. It was Sarah who finally spotted it. "Ley lines," she said, tracing her finger along the map. "It's following the Earth's energy pathways." Tom leaned in, studying the crisscrossing lines. "How do you know about ley lines?" "I did a research project on them back in college. Some people believe they connect places of spiritual significance, like a sort of supernatural highway system." "And you think our entity is using them to travel?" "It makes sense. These are all places of power, where the veil between worlds is thin. It must be drawn to that energy." Tom sat back, his mind racing. "Okay, so we know how it's moving, but we still don't know why or what it wants." As if in answer, a sudden pain lanced through Tom's skull. He doubled over, clutching his head. Sarah was at his side in an instant. Tom? What's wrong? He shook his head, trying to clear the ringing in his ears. But it wasn't ringing, he realized with a chill. It was a voice. The same whispering voice he had heard in the cave, but louder now, more insistent. I can hear it, he gasped. In my head. It's calling to me. Sarah gripped his shoulders, her eyes wide with fear. What's it saying? Tom concentrated, trying to make out the words through the pain. It's not saying anything, it's more like images, impressions. It's hungry, Sarah. It's consuming the energy of the people it takes. Growing stronger. He doubled over again as a fresh wave of agony crashed through his skull. The voice was louder now, drowning out everything else. Sarah held him as he shuddered and convulsed, tears streaming down her face. Fight it, Tom, she pleaded. Don't let it in. It took every ounce of Tom's willpower to wrest back control of his mind. When he finally straightened up, his face was ashen and slick with sweat. We don't have much time, he said hoarsely. It's getting more powerful with each person it takes. Soon it will be too strong to stop. Sarah nodded grimly. Then we have to find a way to beat it to its next target. Can you sense where it's going? Tom closed his eyes, reaching out with his newfound connection to the entity. It was like trying to grasp smoke, but he could feel a faint tug, a distant call. West, he said finally. It's heading west, towards the energy of the ley lines. Sarah was already gathering their notes and supplies. Then that's where we're going too. We'll track it down and put an end to this once and for all. They looked at each other, seeing the determination and fear reflected in each other's eyes. They knew they were heading into the unknown, into a battle they might not win. But they also knew they had no choice. The fate of countless innocent lives hung in the balance, and the only thing standing between the world and the hungry darkness was two lone humans, following an echo of hope across the haunted landscape. As Tom and Sarah raced across the country, chasing the elusive entity, a new development emerged. Sarah, always the analytical one, began to notice a disturbing pattern in the locations of the disappearances. Look at this, she said, spreading a map out on the hood of their car during a rest stop. If we plot out all the incidents, they form a nearly perfect line. Tom peered at the map, his brow furrowed. Ley lines, you said before. But why these specific locations? Sarah traced her finger along the line connecting the sites. They're not just any ley lines. These are major energy pathways linking some of the most spiritually significant places in the country. A chill ran down Tom's spine as realization dawned. It's not just consuming energy from the people it takes, it's drawing power from the ley lines themselves. Sarah nodded grimly, and with each site it visits, it grows stronger. They looked at each other, the weight of their discovery hanging heavy between them. We have to stop it, Tom said, his voice low and determined, before it reaches the next location. But even as he spoke, a familiar pain began to build behind his eyes. He winced, pressing his fingers to his temples. Tom? Sarah asked, concern etched on her face. Is it happening again? He nodded, gritting his teeth against the rising pressure in his skull. The entity's presence was growing stronger, its whispers more insistent. I can see where it's going, he managed. The next point on the ley line. Sarah grabbed the map, her eyes scanning the route ahead. There, she said, stabbing a finger at a spot. Mount Shasta in California. It's a dormant volcano known for its spiritual energy. Tom closed his eyes, focusing on the images flashing through his mind. I can see it, Sarah. The entity, it's excited. This place holds immense power. Sarah rolled up the map decisively. Then that's our next stop. We'll intercept it at Mount Shasta. As they drove, Tom struggled to maintain his mental barriers against the entity's constant probing. It was becoming harder to distinguish his own thoughts from the insidious whispers. It knows we're coming, he told Sarah, his voice strained. It's taunting me, showing me visions of what it will do when it reaches the mountain. Sarah reached over and gripped his hand. We won't let that happen. We'll find a way to stop it. But doubt gnawed at Tom's mind. They were only two people, going up against an ancient, otherworldly being. How could they hope to succeed where so many before them had failed? As if sensing his thoughts, Sarah squeezed his hand. We have something it doesn't, Tom. We have each other. We're in this together, no matter what. Her words bolstered his resolve. He nodded, returning the pressure of her hand. Together. They would face this darkness together. As they approached Mount Shasta, the weight of the entity's presence became almost unbearable. Tom felt as if he were wading through thick, dark water, each step an effort of will. They made camp at the base of the mountain, preparing for their confrontation. As they sat by the flickering light of their campfire, Sarah pored over ancient texts and online archives, searching for any scrap of information that might aid them. There are legends, she said, her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop screen, of ancient shamans who could communicate with the spirits of the earth. They might have known how to banish an entity like this. Tom rubbed his eyes, trying to focus through the haze of whispers in his mind. But how do we access that knowledge? It's not like we can just call up a shaman hotline. Sarah bit her lip, thinking, maybe not, but I might know someone who can help. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts. Dr. Blackwood, my old anthropology professor. He's an expert on indigenous cultures and their spiritual practices. Tom watched as Sarah dialed, hoping against hope that this Dr. Blackwood would have the answers they needed. As Sarah spoke on the phone, Tom stared into the dancing flames of the campfire. The entity's whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was close, so close, and it was hungry. Tom clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. He would not let it win. He would fight, with every ounce of his strength and will, to protect the world from the darkness that threatened to engulf it. For a moment he thought he caught a glimpse of something in the flames. A face, ancient and terrible, with eyes that burned like embers. Tom blinked, and it was gone. Nothing more than a trick of the light. But deep down he knew the truth. The entity was watching them, waiting for its moment to strike. And when it did, they had to be ready. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and Tom and Sarah were the only ones standing in the way of the hungry darkness. They had to succeed. They had to. Because if they failed, the consequences would be too terrible to imagine. Human. Act as a story author and develop only the story from Chapter 14, with a minimum of 800 words, and include dialogue. Assistant. Chapter 14. The Team. As Tom and Sarah raced towards Mount Shasta, their worst fears were realized. The government had taken notice of the strange events occurring across the country, and a task force was assembled to investigate and combat the threat. Tom and Sarah were intercepted at a remote gas station by a group of black-clad agents. They were escorted to a secret facility hidden deep in the wilderness, where they were introduced to the team that had been assembled. Dr. Blackwood, Sarah's old professor, was there, his face lined with worry. He greeted them with a grim nod. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, Sarah, but I'm glad you're here. We need all the help we can get. The task force was made up of experts from various fields, scientists, military strategists, even a few individuals with knowledge of the occult. They had been gathered to pool their knowledge and resources, to find a way to stop the entity before it could wreak further havoc. Tom and Sarah were briefed on what the government knew. The disappearances had been classified as a matter of national security. The public kept in the dark to prevent widespread panic. But even with all their resources, the task force was struggling to understand the nature of the entity they faced. It's unlike anything we've ever encountered, Dr. Blackwood explained. It defies all known laws of physics and biology. We're dealing with something truly otherworldly here. Tom shared what he had learned through his psychic connection to the entity. The team listened intently, their faces growing more somber with each revelation. It's drawing power from the ley lines, Tom said, growing stronger with each site it visits. And it's heading towards Mount Shasta next. The team leader, A grizzled military man named Colonel Briggs leaned forward. "Then that's where we'll make our stand. We'll set up a perimeter around the mountain, use every weapon in our arsenal to take this thing down." But Dr. Blackwood shook his head. "Conventional weapons won't work against this entity. It exists on a different plane of reality. We need to fight it on its own terms." He turned to Sarah. "You mentioned ancient shamanic practices, ways of communicating with the spirits of the earth. That may be our best chance." Sarah nodded. "The legends speak of rituals, methods of banishing malevolent entities. But the knowledge has been lost over time. We'll need to research, to piece together what we can." Colonel Briggs looked skeptical. "Rituals and legends? We need real solutions, not fairy tales." Tom stood up, his eyes blazing. "You think this is a fairy tale? I've been inside this thing's head. I've seen what it can do. If we don't stop it, there won't be a world left to save." An uneasy silence fell over the room. Finally, Dr. Blackwood spoke. "Tom is right. We need to explore every avenue, no matter how unconventional. Sarah and I will work on the shamanic angle. The rest of you prepare for the confrontation at Mount Shasta." As the team dispersed to their tasks, Tom pulled Sarah aside. "Are you sure about this? Messing with ancient rituals, trying to communicate with spirits? It sounds dangerous." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes determined. "More dangerous than facing an all-consuming entity from another world. We have to try, Tom. It's our only hope." Over the next few days, the team worked feverishly to prepare for the showdown at Mount Shasta. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah pored over ancient texts and artifacts, piecing together the fragments of shamanic knowledge. Meanwhile, Tom's mental connection to the entity grew stronger. He could sense its anticipation, its hunger for the power that lay waiting at the sacred site. "It's getting harder to block it out," he confided to Sarah one night, his head in his hands. "I feel like I'm losing myself, becoming a part of it." Sarah gripped his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "You're stronger than it, Tom. You have to be. We need you in this fight." But even as she spoke, Tom could feel the darkness encroaching on his mind, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. He was walking a razor's edge, and he knew that one false step could send him plunging into the abyss. As the day of the confrontation drew near, the team gathered for a final briefing. Colonel Briggs outlined the military strategy, the positions of the troops and weapons that would be deployed. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah shared what they had learned about the ancient rituals. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope they had. Tom listened, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they were about to face. He could feel the entity's presence closer than ever, waiting for them at the mountain. As the meeting broke up, Sarah took his hand. "We can do this, Tom. Together, no matter what happens. I'm with you." Tom nodded, drawing strength from her presence. They had come this far, fought this hard. They couldn't give up now. But as they boarded the helicopters that would take them to Mount Shasta, Tom couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him like a shroud. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. And deep down, Tom feared that even with all their preparation and knowledge, they were still hopelessly outmatched. The entity was waiting for them, and it was hungry. So very, very hungry. The helicopters landed at the base of Mount Shasta, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Tom, Sarah, and the rest of the team disembarked, their faces grim with determination. Colonel Briggs barked orders to his troops, directing them to take up their positions around the perimeter. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah hurried to set up the equipment they would need for the shamanic ritual. Tom stood at the edge of the clearing, staring up at the looming peak of the mountain. He could feel the entity's presence, stronger than ever. It was here, waiting for them. Sarah came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Tom nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be, let's do this." They joined Dr. Blackwood at the center of the clearing, where he had laid out an intricate array of ancient artifacts and symbols. The ritual they were about to perform was a complex one, requiring precise timing and intense concentration. As they took their positions, the rest of the team watched in tense silence. Colonel Briggs had his men on high alert, ready to respond to any threat. Dr. Blackwood began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic. Sarah joined in, her words intertwining with his. Tom closed his eyes, reaching out with his mind to the entity that lurked on the mountain. At first there was nothing. Then, slowly, he began to feel a presence, a dark and malevolent force that seemed to be drawing closer. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "It's coming," he said through gritted teeth. "Get ready." The team tensed, weapons at the ready. The air seemed to crackle with energy, the very fabric of reality warping and distorting. And then, with a roar that shook the earth, the entity burst forth from the mountain. It was a thing of nightmare, a seething mass of darkness and chaos. Tendrils of shadow lashed out, seeking to ensnare anything in their path. The military opened fire, but their bullets passed harmlessly through the entity's incorporeal form. Colonel Briggs shouted orders, but it was clear that their weapons were useless. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah's chanting grew louder, more urgent. They poured all their energy and will into the ritual, calling upon the ancient spirits of the earth to aid them. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The entity wavered, its form flickering and dimming. But then, with a surge of power, it broke free of the shamanic bonds and lunged forward. Tom threw himself in front of Sarah, shielding her with his body. The entity's tendrils wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground. He screamed in agony as the darkness surged into his mind, overwhelming his senses. Sarah cried out his name, but her voice seemed distant, muffled. Tom felt himself slipping away, his consciousness subsumed by the entity's ravenous hunger. But then, deep within him, a spark of resistance flickered to life. He remembered Sarah's words, her belief in him. He remembered the lives that hung in the balance, the world that needed him. With a roar of defiance, Tom wrenched himself free of the entity's grasp. He stood before it, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unearthly light. "You won't win," he snarled. "I won't let you." The entity hesitated, confused by this unexpected resistance. In that moment of weakness, Dr. Blackwood and Sarah redoubled their efforts, pouring every ounce of their strength into the ritual. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, cracks spreading out from the center of the clearing. A vortex of swirling energy opened up, a rift between worlds. "The portal!" Dr. Blackwood shouted. "We must force it through." Tom nodded, understanding what he had to do. He reached out with his mind, grappling with the entity's essence. It was like trying to hold on to smoke, but slowly, inexorably, he began to push it towards the rift. The entity fought back, lashing out with tendrils of darkness. But Tom stood firm, his will unbreakable. Step by step, he drove the entity back towards the yawning maw of the portal. With a final desperate surge of energy, Tom shoved the entity through the rift. It howled in rage and despair as it was sucked into the vortex, its form dissipating into nothingness. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the portal snapped shut. The sudden silence was deafening. Tom collapsed to his knees, exhausted beyond measure. Sarah ran to him, throwing her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us all." Tom clung to her, his body shaking with relief and fatigue. The rest of the team gathered around them, their faces alight with joy and wonder. But even as they celebrated their victory, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The entity had been defeated, but who knew what other horrors lurked out there, waiting to be unleashed. For now, though, they had won. They had stood against the darkness and prevailed, and that was enough. As the sun began to set over Mount Shasta, casting the world in a golden glow, Tom and Sarah held each other close, savoring the moment of peace. They knew that the fight was far from over, but they also knew that as long as they had each other, as long as they had the strength of their love and their shared purpose, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The battle had been won, but the war continued. And Tom and Sarah would be there on the front lines, ready to meet it head-on. The team arrived at Yellowstone National Park, the site of their planned confrontation with the entity. The air was thick with tension as they set up their equipment, the weight of what was to come hanging heavy on their shoulders. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah worked tirelessly to prepare the shamanic ritual, while Colonel Briggs and his men positioned themselves around the perimeter, ready to respond to any threat. Tom stood at the edge of the geyser basin, staring into the steaming vents and bubbling pools. He could feel the entity's presence, stronger than ever, drawn by the power of the geothermal energy. "It's close," he said, his voice tight with strain. "I can feel it, just out of reach." Sarah came to stand beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We're ready, Tom. The ritual, the trap, it's all in place. We just need to lure it in." Tom nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know what I have to do." He stepped forward, closing his eyes and reaching out with his mind. He called to the entity, taunting it, challenging it to face him. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the ground began to tremble, a deep, ominous rumble that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "It's coming!" Colonel Briggs shouted, his men snapping to attention. The entity burst forth from the largest geyser, a seething mass of darkness and malevolence. It towered over them, its form shifting and writhing in the steaming mist. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah began the ritual, their voices rising in an ancient chant. The symbols they had carved into the ground around the geyser began to glow, pulsing with an eerie blue light. The entity let out a roar of rage, lashing out with tendrils of shadow. The soldiers opened fire, but their bullets passed harmlessly through its incorporeal form. Tom stood at the center of the chaos, his eyes locked on the entity. He could feel its hunger, its insatiable desire to consume and destroy. "Now, Tom," Sarah cried, "bring it into the trap." Tom nodded, steeling himself. He reached out with his mind, grasping at the entity's essence. It was like trying to hold on to smoke, but he refused to let go. With a grunt of effort, he began to draw the entity towards the glowing symbols, the shamanic trap they had laid. The entity fought back, its whispers clawing at Tom's mind. He could feel its rage, its desperation. It knew what they were trying to do. But Tom held on, pouring every ounce of his will into the struggle. Inch by inch, he pulled the entity closer to the trap. And then, with a final wrenching effort, he dragged it into the center of the glowing symbols. The trap sprang shut, the blue light intensifying into a blinding glare. The entity let out a howl of rage and pain, its form contorting and twisting. For a moment, it seemed as if they had succeeded. The entity was contained, writhing and thrashing within the confines of the trap. But then, with a surge of power that shook the very ground beneath their feet, the entity broke free. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, striking at the team with devastating force. Soldiers were flung through the air like ragdolls, their screams echoing off the rocky walls of the geyser basin. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah were knocked to the ground, the ritual disrupted. The glowing symbols flickered and died, the trap shattered beyond repair. And in the center of it all stood Tom, alone and unprotected. The entity loomed over him, its form swelling with power and malice. "You thought you could trap me," it hissed, its voice like the cracking of ice. "You thought your pitiful human magic could contain me." Tom stared up at the entity, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should be afraid, but all he felt was a strange, calm certainty. "No," he said softly. "I didn't think we could trap you. Not really. But I knew we could distract you long enough to do what needs to be done." The entity hesitated, confusion flickering across its shadowy features. "What are you talking about?" Tom smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "The ritual wasn't the trap. I am." And with those words, he lunged forward, throwing himself into the heart of the entity's form. The darkness engulfed him, cold and crushing. He could feel the entity's essence all around him, tearing at his mind and soul. But even as he felt himself slipping away, consumed by the endless hunger of the entity, Tom held on to one final, desperate thought. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice lost in the roaring void. "I love you." And then, with a blinding flash of light, Tom and the entity vanished, drawn into the rift between worlds. Sarah screamed, her voice raw with grief and horror. She struggled to her feet, staring at the spot where Tom had been only moments before. The rest of the team gathered around her, their faces ashen with shock and disbelief. Colonel Briggs laid a hand on her shoulder, his voice gruff with emotion. "He did it," he said. "He sacrificed himself to save us all." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, he's not gone. I can still feel him, somewhere out there." Dr. Blackwood looked at her, his eyes wide with realization. "The rift," he breathed. "Tom opened a portal between worlds when he merged with the entity. If we can find a way to reopen it." Sarah nodded, her grief hardening into determination. "Then we can bring him back. We have to try." The team looked at each other, the weight of their task settling on their shoulders. They had come so close to victory, only to have it snatched away at the last moment. But they knew they couldn't give up. Not now. Not when there was still a chance to save Tom and defeat the entity once and for all. As the sun began to set over Yellowstone, casting long shadows across the steaming landscape, the team gathered their equipment and prepared to leave. They had a new mission now, a new purpose. They would find a way to reopen the rift, to bring Tom back from the darkness, and put an end to the entity's reign of terror. It wouldn't be easy. They knew that. But they also knew that they had no choice. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and they were the only ones who could tip the scales in favor of light and life. As they set out into the gathering darkness, Sarah looked up at the stars, her heart aching with loss and longing. "Hold on, Tom," she whispered. "We're coming for you. Just hold on." And somewhere, in the vast, echoing emptiness between worlds, a flicker of light pulsed in response, a tiny spark of hope in the endless void. Tom found himself in a world of endless darkness, a void that stretched in all directions. He felt disoriented, his senses struggling to make sense of his surroundings. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice swallowed by the emptiness. As his eyes adjusted, he began to make out shapes in the gloom. Twisted, ghostly figures drifted past him, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and despair. "Hello?" Tom called out, his heart pounding in his chest. "Is anyone there?" A figure detached itself from the swirling shadows gliding towards him. As it drew closer, Tom saw that it was a man, his features gaunt and haunted. "You're new here," the man said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Just arrived by the looks of it." Tom nodded, swallowing hard. "Where is here exactly?" The man let out a humorless chuckle. "The other side, of course. The realm of the lost and the damned. The place where the entity sends its victims." Tom's blood ran cold. He remembered the final, desperate moments before he had merged with the entity, the blinding flash of light that had torn him from his world. "So I'm dead?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man shook his head. "Not dead, no, but not alive either. Trapped, like the rest of us, in this endless purgatory." Tom looked around, taking in the bleak, hopeless landscape. "How long have you been here?" The man shrugged. "Time has no meaning in this place. It could be days or centuries. All I know is that there is no escape, no way out." Tom refused to accept that. He thought of Sarah, of his friends and allies back in the real world. They would be looking for a way to bring him back, he was sure of it. "There has to be a way," he said, his voice growing stronger. "The entity, it's not invincible. It can be defeated." The man looked at him, a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. "You really believe that?" Tom nodded. "I do. I've seen it, fought against it, and I'm not giving up now." He looked around, his mind racing. The entity, it draws its power from the ley lines, from the energy of the earth. Maybe there's a way to use that against it even here. The man considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. "I've heard stories," he said slowly. "Whispers from some of the older ones. They say there are places of power even in this realm, nexus points where the boundaries between worlds grow thin." Tom's heart leapt. "Can you take me there?" The man hesitated, fear and uncertainty warring in his eyes, but finally he nodded. "I can try, but I warn you the journey will not be easy. There are dangers in this place, horrors beyond imagining." Tom set his jaw, his determination unwavering. "I'm not afraid. I'll do whatever it takes." And so the two set out, navigating the twisted, nightmarish landscape of the other side. They passed through forests of gnarled, whispering trees, across rivers of black, oily water that seemed to pull at their very souls. They encountered other lost souls along the way, some friendly, others hostile. Tom learned that the entity had been trapping people in this realm for centuries, feeding off their despair and suffering. But he also learned that there was a resistance, a group of souls who had banded together to fight against the entity's tyranny. They whispered of a prophecy, of a chosen one who would come to lead them to victory. As word of Tom's arrival spread, more and more souls flocked to his banner. They saw in him a spark of hope, a chance at freedom and salvation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of wandering, they arrived at the nexus point. It was a place of raw, primal energy, where the veil between worlds had grown thin and translucent. Tom could feel the power thrumming in the air, could sense the presence of the entity just beyond the veil. He turned to his newfound allies, his voice ringing with conviction. "This is it," he said. "Our chance to strike back, to defeat the entity once and for all." The souls gathered around him, their faces alight with hope and determination. They knew the risks, knew that they might be marching to their final doom. But they also knew that they had to try, had to seize this one, precious chance at freedom. As they prepared to cross over, to launch their assault on the entity's domain, Tom felt a sudden, wrenching sensation in his chest. He gasped, doubling over in pain. It felt as if something was trying to pull him back, to tear him away from this place. "Tom!" a voice called out, distant and echoing. "Tom, can you hear me?" He recognized that voice, would know it anywhere. It was Sarah calling to him from across the veil. Tears of relief and longing sprang to his eyes. He had been fighting for so long, had almost lost hope of ever seeing her again. But now, with the end in sight, with victory within their grasp, he knew that he had to finish what he had started. He straightened up, squaring his shoulders. "I hear you, Sarah," he called out, his voice ringing through the nexus. "I'm coming home, but first I have to end this once and for all." He turned to his allies, his eyes blazing with determination. "Are you with me?" As one, they raised their voices in a resounding cry of assent. They would follow him to the end and beyond. Together they turned to face the veil, ready to cross over and confront the entity on its own ground. Tom took a deep breath, feeling the power of the nexus surging through him. He thought of Sarah, of his friends and loved ones back in the real world. "Hold on," he whispered. "I'm coming." And with that, he stepped forward, leading his army of lost souls into the final battle, into the heart of darkness itself. The fate of two worlds hung in the balance, and Tom would not rest until the entity was defeated, until the cycle of suffering and despair was broken at last. For he knew, deep in his heart, that even in the darkest of places, there was always a flicker of hope, a spark of light that could never be extinguished. And he would be that light, that beacon of hope, for all those who had been lost and forgotten. He would fight, and he would win, no matter the cost. For he was Tom, the chosen one, the savior of souls. And his journey was just beginning. Sarah stood at the edge of the rift, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Tom's presence just beyond the veil, tantalizingly close and yet impossibly far away. "Tom," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion, "please come back to me." Behind her, the rest of the team worked feverishly to reopen the portal. Dr. Blackwood pored over ancient texts, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Colonel Briggs barked orders to his men. But Sarah barely noticed them. All of her attention, all of her energy, was focused on the rift, on the faint, flickering connection that bound her to Tom. She closed her eyes, reaching out with her mind and heart. She pictured Tom's face, his warm, gentle smile, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. "I know you're out there," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can feel you, Tom, and I'm not giving up on you. Not now, not ever." As if in response, the rift began to pulse and writhe, tendrils of energy snaking out from its depths. Sarah gasped, her eyes flying open. "It's working!" Dr. Blackwood cried out, his voice filled with excitement. "The connection, it's growing stronger." Colonel Briggs nodded, his face grim with determination. "Then let's bring our boy home." The team redoubled their efforts, pouring all of their energy and will into the task at hand. The air crackled with electricity, the very fabric of reality warping and twisting. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the rift tore open, a swirling vortex of energy and chaos. Sarah stumbled back, shielding her eyes against the glare. But even as she did, she felt a sudden wrenching sensation in her chest, as if an invisible cord had been yanked taut. "Tom!" she cried out, her voice raw with emotion. "Tom, can you hear me?" For a moment there was nothing, only the howling winds of the rift. But then, faintly at first, then growing stronger, Sarah heard a voice. "Sarah?" It was Tom, his voice distant and echoing, but unmistakably his. "Sarah, is that you?" Tears of relief and joy streamed down Sarah's face. "Yes, Tom, it's me. We're here. We're going to bring you back." But even as she spoke, Sarah sensed a growing tension in the air, a rising sense of danger. The entity, she realized with a chill, it knew what they were attempting, and it was not going to let its prey go without a fight. The rift began to convulse and shudder, dark, oily tendrils of energy lashing out from its depths. The team scattered, diving for cover as the tendrils whipped through the air. "It's fighting back," Dr. Blackwood shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rift. "We have to hold on, keep the connection stable." Sarah gritted her teeth, pouring all of her strength and love into the bond that tied her to Tom. She could feel him just on the other side, fighting to reach her. "Tom, listen to me," she called out, her voice steady and clear. "You have to fight, Tom. Fight the entity. Fight your way back to us. We're here. We're waiting for you." For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then suddenly, the rift exploded with light, a blinding, searing brightness that forced Sarah to look away. When she opened her eyes again, the rift was gone, and in its place stood a shimmering, translucent portal. And there, on the other side, was Tom, his face alight with joy and wonder. "Sarah," he breathed, reaching out to her. "I knew you'd find me." Sarah let out a sob of relief, lunging forward to embrace him. But as her hands passed through the portal, she felt a sudden, sickening lurch, as if the world had tilted on its axis. "Tom, something's wrong," she gasped, her eyes widening in horror. "The portal, it's not stable." Dr. Blackwood rushed forward, his face ashen. "The entity, it's not going to let Tom go without a fight. We have to act fast before it's too late." Colonel Briggs nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then we go in, we get Tom, and we get out. No matter what it takes." Sarah looked at her friends, her allies, seeing the same fierce resolve in their eyes. They had come this far, had fought so hard. They were not going to lose Tom, not now, not ever. Together they stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the portal. The world around them shimmered and twisted, reality bending and warping in impossible ways. And there, waiting for them on the other side, was Tom, his arms open wide, his face alight with love and gratitude. "I knew you'd come for me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never doubted it. Not for a second. Sarah threw her arms around him, holding him close, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of his body against hers. "I'll always come for you, Tom," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "No matter where you are, no matter what stands in our way, I'll always find you." Together, hand in hand, they turned to face the entity, ready to end its reign of terror once and for all. They had each other, and they had their love, and in that moment Sarah knew that nothing could stand against them, not even the darkest of evils, for they were bound by a connection that transcended time and space, a bond that could never be broken. And together they would fight, and they would win, no matter the cost. Tom and Sarah emerged from the portal, hand in hand, their faces alight with joy and relief. Behind them, the rest of the team followed, blinking in the sudden brightness of the sun. They found themselves back in the clearing at Yellowstone, the portal shimmering and pulsing behind them. For a moment, all was still, the only sound the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. But then, with a roar of fury and defiance, the entity burst forth from the rift, its form swelling and writhing with malevolent energy. "You thought you could escape me?" it hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could defeat me here in your world of light and life?" Tom stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "We didn't just think it. We know it. Your reign of terror ends here, entity. We won't let you hurt anyone else ever again." The entity laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "You are nothing, human. You are but insects to me, to be crushed and consumed at my whim." But even as it spoke, Sarah could sense a flicker of uncertainty in its voice, a hint of fear behind the bravado. "You're wrong," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "We are more than you can ever understand, entity. We have something you will never have: love, compassion, the strength that comes from standing together." The entity snarled, lashing out with tendrils of shadow and darkness. The team scattered, diving for cover as the clearing erupted into chaos. Colonel Briggs and his men opened fire, their weapons blazing with searing light. Dr. Blackwood and Sarah began to chant, weaving a web of ancient magic around the entity, seeking to bind and contain it. But the entity was strong, fueled by centuries of stolen life and power. It shrugged off their attacks, its form growing larger and more terrible with each passing moment. "You cannot win," it roared, its voice shaking the very earth beneath their feet. "I am eternal. I am undefeatable." Tom shook his head, a sad smile playing across his lips. "No, you're not. You're just a bully, a coward who preys on the weak and the helpless. But we are not weak, and we are not helpless. And we will stop you." He reached out, taking Sarah's hand in his. Together, they began to walk towards the entity, their steps slow and measured, their eyes locked on their foe. The entity hesitated, confusion and fear flickering across its monstrous features. "What are you doing?" it demanded, its voice tinged with panic. "Stay back, or I will destroy you." But Tom and Sarah kept coming, their faces alight with a calm, implacable resolve. They could feel the love and strength of their friends, their allies, flowing through them, bolstering their courage and their will. "We are not afraid of you," Tom said, his voice quiet but firm. "We have faced darkness before, and we have come through it stronger. And we will face you now, and we will defeat you." The entity let out a howl of rage and fear, lunging forward with all its might. But Tom and Sarah stood fast, their hands clasped tight, their hearts beating as one. And as the entity crashed against them, they felt a sudden, blinding surge of energy, a power that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was the power of love, of unity, of the unbreakable bonds that tied them together. And as it flowed through them, they felt the entity beginning to weaken, its form shrinking and fading away. "No," it screamed, its voice high and desperate. "This cannot be. I am invincible. I am eternal." But even as it spoke, the last of its strength drained away, and with a final despairing wail, the entity vanished, dissipating into nothingness. For a long, stunned moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, hesitantly, the team began to cheer, their voices rising in a chorus of joy and triumph. Tom and Sarah turned to each other, their eyes shining with tears of relief and happiness. They embraced, holding each other tight, savoring the feeling of being together, of being alive. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We won." Tom nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Yes, we did. Because we had each other, and we had our friends. And that's something the entity could never understand, could never defeat." They looked around at their team, at the brave men and women who had fought beside them, who had risked everything to save the world from darkness. Colonel Briggs stepped forward, his face split in a wide grin. "That was some damn fine work, Tom," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You too, Sarah. I'm proud to have fought beside you." Dr. Blackwood nodded, his eyes twinkling with relief and satisfaction. "Indeed. I must say I had my doubts at times. But you two proved me wrong, proved all of us wrong. You are true heroes, in every sense of the word." Tom shook his head, a humble smile playing across his lips. "We're not heroes," he said softly. "We're just people. People who refuse to give up, who refuse to let the darkness win." He looked at Sarah, his eyes shining with love and pride. "And we had each other," he said. "That's what made the difference in the end. That's what gave us the strength to keep fighting no matter what." Sarah nodded, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. "And we always will," she said. "No matter what the future holds, no matter what challenges we face, we'll face them together side by side forever and always." And as the sun began to set over Yellowstone, casting the world in a warm, golden glow, Tom and Sarah stood hand in hand, ready to face whatever lay ahead. For they knew that as long as they had each other, as long as they had the love and support of their friends and allies, there was nothing they couldn't overcome, no darkness they couldn't conquer. Together they had saved the world, and together they would continue to fight, to protect, to love, for all the days to come. As the dust settled and the reality of their victory sank in, Tom and Sarah looked at each other, their faces etched with a mixture of relief, joy, and a dawning realization. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "But at what cost?" Tom nodded, his eyes clouding with worry. "The entity may be gone, but the damage it caused, the lives it ruined, that doesn't just go away." They looked around at the clearing, at the scars left by the battle. The once pristine landscape was now marred by scorched earth and shattered trees, a testament to the devastation that had been wrought. "We have to make this right," Tom said, his voice filled with determination. "We have to find a way to heal the wounds, to bring back what was lost." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "The Nexus points," she said. "If we can harness their power, use it to repair the damage." Dr. Blackwood stepped forward, his face grave. "It's possible," he said, "but it won't be easy. The Nexus points are unpredictable, volatile. Tapping into their energy could be dangerous, even deadly." Tom and Sarah exchanged a long, searching look. They both knew the risks, knew the price that might have to be paid, but they also knew that they couldn't walk away, couldn't leave the world to suffer in the wake of the entity's destruction. "We have to try," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "We have a responsibility to the people we saved, to the world we fought for." Tom nodded, his eyes blazing with resolve. "Whatever it takes," he said, "no matter the cost." Together they set out, following the invisible lines of power that crisscrossed the globe. They journeyed to ancient ruins and sacred sites, to places where the veil between worlds was thin, and the energy of the Nexus points thrummed like a heartbeat. At each location, they worked to harness the power, to channel it into the wounds left by the entity. It was grueling, dangerous work, and more than once, they found themselves pushed to the brink of exhaustion and despair. But they refused to give up, refused to let the sacrifices they had made be in vain, and slowly, painfully, the world began to heal. Forests regrew, rivers ran clear once more, and the scars left by the entity's rampage faded like a half-remembered nightmare. But the cost was high. With each nexus point they tapped, Tom and Sarah could feel the energy taking its toll, could feel their own life force beginning to wane. They knew they were running out of time, knew that soon, the power they wielded would consume them entirely. But still, they pressed on, driven by a fierce, unshakable love for each other and for the world they had sworn to protect. And then, at last, they came to the final nexus point, the most powerful and perilous of them all. They stood at the edge of a vast, swirling vortex of energy, its power thrumming through their veins like molten fire. "This is it," Tom said, his voice tight with emotion. "The last one." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We've come so far," she whispered. "Farther than I ever thought possible." Tom reached out, taking her hand in his. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You gave me the strength, the courage to keep going." Sarah smiled, a sad, tender smile. "And you gave me a reason to fight, to believe in something bigger than myself." They looked at each other, their hearts full to bursting with love and gratitude. "Together?" Tom asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Together," Sarah answered, her hand tightening around his, and with one last fierce embrace, they stepped forward, into the heart of the maelstrom. The energy surged through them, a searing, blinding force that threatened to tear them apart. But they held on, to each other, and to their love, pouring every ounce of their strength and will into the task at hand. They could feel the nexus point responding, could feel the power flowing out of them and into the world, healing and restoring all that had been lost. And as the last of their life force drained away, as their bodies began to fade and dissolve into the swirling vortex of energy, Tom and Sarah looked at each other one last time. "I love you," Tom whispered, his voice fading like a distant echo. "I love you too," Sarah answered, her eyes shining with a fierce, unquenchable light. And then, in a flash of blinding radiance, they were gone, their sacrifice complete, their love triumphant. The world would never forget them, would never forget the heroes who had given everything to save it from the brink of destruction. And though they were gone, their legacy lived on, in the hearts and minds of all those they had touched, in the beauty and wonder of the world they had fought so hard to protect. For in the end, their love had been the greatest power of all, a force that could move mountains and reshape the very fabric of reality. And it was that love, pure and unending, that would endure, long after they were gone, a shining beacon of hope and courage, in a world that had been forever changed by their sacrifice. Years had passed since the fateful day when Tom and Sarah made their ultimate sacrifice. The world had changed, slowly but surely, healing from the wounds inflicted by the entity's reign of terror. But even as life returned to a semblance of normalcy, the memory of the two heroes who had given everything to save humanity lingered, a bittersweet echo of love and loss. In the heart of the Grand Canyon, a young ranger named Lila stood at the edge of the chasm, her eyes scanning the rugged, timeless landscape. She had grown up on stories of Tom and Sarah, had marveled at their courage and devotion in the face of impossible odds, and now, as she stood in the place where their journey had begun, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder, tinged with a strange, inexplicable longing. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon in shades of gold and crimson, Lila heard a sound, faint and distant yet hauntingly familiar. It was an echo, bouncing off the ancient walls of the canyon, a whisper of something long forgotten. Lila froze, her heart racing as she strained to make out the words. "Beware," the echo whispered, its voice a ghostly reflection of Tom and Sarah's. "The entity may be gone, but its legacy lives on. Lila's eyes widened, a chill racing down her spine. She had heard the stories, of course, had known that the entity's defeat had come at a great cost. But to hear those words, spoken in the voices of the heroes who had sacrificed everything, it was like a bolt of lightning, searing and unforgettable. She turned, her mind reeling, only to find herself face to face with an old man, his weathered features etched with a lifetime of wisdom and sorrow. "You heard it too," he said, his voice soft and knowing. "The echo." Lila nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old man sighed, his eyes distant and haunted. "It means that the fight is not over," he said. "The entity may be gone, but its darkness lingers, waiting for the right moment to strike." Lila felt a surge of fear, mingled with a fierce, unshakable determination. "Then we have to be ready," she said, her voice strong and clear. "We have to finish what Tom and Sarah started." The old man smiled, a sad, proud smile. "You have their spirit," he said, "their courage, their love for this world and all its wonders." He reached out, placing a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder. "But you must be careful," he warned. "The road ahead will not be easy. There will be sacrifices, just as there were before." Lila nodded, her jaw set with resolve. "I understand," she said, "but I can't turn away, not now. Not when there's still work to be done." The old man nodded, his eyes shining with a fierce, ancient light. "Then go," he said. "Follow the echo, wherever it leads. And remember, you are not alone. Tom and Sarah's legacy lives on, in you and in all those who refuse to let the darkness win." Lila felt a surge of emotion, a fierce, unshakable love for the world and all its beauty, for the heroes who had given everything to protect it. She turned, her steps sure and strong, following the echo as it led her deeper into the canyon, into the heart of the mystery that had haunted humanity for so long. And as she walked, she could feel the presence of Tom and Sarah, could sense their love and their courage, guiding her forward. They had made the ultimate sacrifice, had given their lives so that others might live. And now, it was up to Lila and all those who followed in their footsteps to ensure that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, full of danger and uncertainty, but Lila knew that she was not alone, that she carried the hopes and dreams of all those who had come before her, and with every step, she could feel the echo growing stronger, could sense the power and the purpose that had driven Tom and Sarah to make their final, fateful choice. "I won't let you down," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. "I'll finish what you started, no matter what it takes." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of purple and indigo, Lila knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, for the echo of love and sacrifice, of courage and hope, would never fade, as long as there were those who were willing to listen, to follow its call. And in the end, that echo would be the light that guided humanity through the darkness, towards a future bright with promise and possibility. So Lila walked on, into the gathering twilight, ready to face whatever lay ahead, armed with the knowledge that she carried the hopes and dreams of all those who had come before her. And in her heart, the echo of Tom and Sarah's love burned bright, a beacon of hope and courage that would never be extinguished, no matter how dark the road ahead might be.